Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents. Today, I'm going to be discussing uh, the history of the English uh, government, the English Parliament, how it evolved up until the time we inherited the colonies from the king, and then we had our Declaration of Independence, which established the United States of America. I think this is important because remember, our government in America was originally created through charters established by the English sovereign, right? Of course, the charters established the colonies in the Americas, and we're trying to see how we were governed because remember, the our founding fathers in their declaration complained about the revocation of charters and using arbitrary forms of government. Now, something else that I want to point out is I'd mentioned that our founding fathers, our framers, were of course Englishmen, right? And I also want to emphasize that the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and our Constitution, they were not original documents, right? So they are part of the English heritage, the Western civilization. And so just looking a little bit, taking a look at English history, which I'm about to do, we'll see how we were actually channeling many of the laws, the statutes, including the Magna Carta, from the English form of government and their traditions. Now, I've mentioned earlier that the British didn't have, they still don't have a written constitution. So they have an unwritten constitution, but they've had a variety of statutes, including the Magna Carta, which found, they established the foundational documents of English the English law and their system of government and their uncodified constitution as they see it. Um, and so when we talk about our Bill of Rights, of course, of 1791, when I discuss this history, you'll see our founding fathers were actually challenging the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Yes, the English had a Bill of Rights before us. It's also called the Declaration of Rights. And so you see, we were channeling a number of their practices and even the notion that was expressed in the Declaration, the notion that that people that governments are established through the consent of the governed, right? These are things that came up earlier amongst parliament. There was the conflict between parliament and the king of England, and they were trying to curtail the powers of the king and establish themselves as co-sovereign and just enhance their influence in the British government. So you see that the ideas our founding fathers were voicing in the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. They had their origins in the English system of government and in British history. And so I'm going to quickly dive into it because I want to try and keep this video short, and then I'll engage in further discussions later on. So, um, so again, these challenges, the notion all men are created equal, challenging, the sovereignty, the divine rights of the king. These aren't new. These are things that Englishmen, the parliament, the nobles had done several times in English history, and that's what I'm going to dive into now. Let me start from the very beginning, right? England, was Britain. I'm going to go all the way back to the Roman Empire when the Romans first landed in what they came to later call the Roman province of Britannia, right? So Julius Caesar is said to be the first Roman who went to that area, to Britain, and it was around 55, 54 BC. He didn't conquer the land, but of course he established some form of trade and other interactions. Now, subsequently, in the first century AD, was it about 43 AD? Emperor Claudius went all out and invaded, uh, the area known as Britain, and the Romans subsequently occupied Britain from the first century AD up until about 410 AD when they left. So it became Britannia became a province of the Romans, the Roman Empire, and of course they left their influence in the roads, the network of roads that they built, their culture, Roman culture, and of course Hadrian's Wall is very famous. They built Hadrian's Wall, which set the limits of the limits of the empire, the border. So they left in 410 AD, but I have English friends, so I schooled briefly in England, and my friends there noted how the Romans did not leave their language, that they were there for so long, for almost 4 centuries, but they did not, leave vestiges of their language. So uh, today, if you hear the Welsh speaking, they speak, a Celtic form of language. That's similar to what the Romans would have found the inhabitants of Britain speaking back then, the Celtic language of the Welsh, right? So that's similar to what they were speaking. And so after the Romans left in about 410 AD, the Romans speak Latin, right? I mean, the Romans, they spoke Latin, right? So you see, uh, Latin became the language of the erudite. And in fact, I'm going to quote some Latin as we go on. So after the Romans left, a group of people started coming in. The the Saxons, right? A group of Germanic tribes now invaded. They came from the continent, the continental Europe, and they were Germanic tribes. They were the Angles, the Jutes, and the Saxons. They invaded and they settled in in the area of Britain, right? They settled there, settled in England, what came to be England. Now, I remember when I first went to work uh, in an investment bank about 20 years ago, I had a colleague who told me I needed to be careful and to observe that the firm was dominated by wasps. It was the first time I heard of a wasp. So I asked her, "What's a wasp?" Of course, that's acronym for White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? Anglo-Saxon. So they use that term a lot here, Anglo-Saxon. Um, of course, I come from Nigeria, which was colonized by the British. In fact, Nigeria was created by the British by amalgamating, merging a number of different kingdoms, and they named it Nigeria, right? And so, of course, I grew up, I had British teachers growing up, English, but we just call them British. We didn't say Anglo-Saxon or anything like that. We said British. So, Anglo-Saxon is a term that they like to use in America, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And so, we see the origin. They were Germanic tribes who went to England, and they were the Angles, right? The Angles. There are the Jutes and then the Saxons. So the merger of those two Germanic tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, those were the Anglo-Saxon. And Angles, I guess that's where you have the name of England, right? Angles, right? That's where they acquired the name of England. So they were Germanic tribes. They came they invaded the area of what came to be known as England in about the 5th century, and they stayed there. And their Germanic languages now dominated, right? The Germanic languages now dominated the area. So this was around the 5th century AD. So there were Germanic tribes, and so that's how the Anglo-Saxons came to occupy England, right? About the 5th century AD, after the Romans left. Now, over time, um, of course, the Normans. Everybody knows of the Norman invasion. So the Normans came in about 1066 with William the Conqueror. He was a Duke of Normandy. Now, William the Conqueror was French. He was a Frenchman. Normandy is an area in France, but the Normans were actually Norsemen, right? They were Vikings. Norsemen were the Vikings, but they adapted French culture, right? Because they invaded the area that's France. And so they adapted French culture and they spoke French. So William the Conqueror, he invaded England, and he established the pattern, the legacy of English kings and the aristocracy as we know today. Him and his military lords. So they're French people, and you see that they established the English royalty and the aristocracy that we know of. And before I get fully into that, though, let me state how the history of uh, blending the secular authority with sacred authority, ecclesiastical authority, because this came to be embodied in the personage of the king, right? So there was a guy called Charlemagne, right? Not Charlemagne the God. Charlemagne the God, I guess, adapted his name from Charlemagne. Charlemagne was king of the Franks, right? So the Franks, the area of his empire, right? The Franks aren't exactly French people, but his empire, that's Charlemagne the Frank, his empire included what's modern day France, modern day Germany, the Netherlands, and of course, and Belgium. So it was a vast empire, for those times. And so in 800 AD, he had started conquering all these lands. He was a Frankish king, and eventually in 800 AD, on December 25, this is very famous in European history. Most kings like to they like to allude to Charlemagne. He was crowned by the Pope Leo III, right? The Pope Leo III. So we have today the incumbent Pope of the Roman Catholic Church is Leo XIV, and of course he's an American. But before him, there was Pope Leo III. So Leo is a very important name amongst papal authorities because Pope Leo III, was the one who crowned Charlemagne as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, right? Of course, the Roman Empire, the western side had already been decimated. There was the eastern side, which was now Constantinople, which had now had more influence. But of course, the original Roman Empire was on the western side. So Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, in England, in if you did history, we call it the greatest misnomer in history. I remember I had a professor who used to say, and it was an English professor, and he used to say that it's the biggest misnomer because it was not holy, it was not Roman, and it was not an empire. Of course, Charlemagne was not Roman. Charlemagne was a Frank. So a Frank is a Germanic tribe, right? A Frank is a sort of a Germanic tribe. So that was who Charlemagne was. And so he was crowned by the Pope because he was the most powerful warlord or king at that time in the area. This was 800 AD, and he had given protection to the Pope. So the significance, the symbolism of the Pope crowning Charlemagne, right? It established the tradition of kings in Europe, right, as having divine rights, as having been crowned by God Himself, because the Pope, right, the Pope is considered the vicar of Christ, the representative of God on earth. Those are the titles of the Pope, and so, of course, those were ancient Christian traditions. But these are things that they're ancient church traditions. But of course, people were very superstitious back then. And of course, law was not yet developed. A lot of our laws actually came from religion, right? It came from religion. Government was not yet very established. And governments were established through military force. Whoever had the sword, they got to establish the law. And if you got lucky, they imbibed some form of religious dogma that protected the people that were a little bit moral, right, in nature. And so this was what Charlemagne was doing. We know if we look back in history, even the ascendancy of the Christians were initially persecuted about 2,000 years ago. But about the fourth century, when a Roman emperor, Constantine, when he adopted Christianity, embraced Christianity, and made it a state religion, That was how Christianity became very powerful, right? And they became very rich. So by the time of Charlemagne, he provided protection to the Pope, and the Pope then crowned him as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, right? Again, it was not really an empire. These things that it was just symbolic, right? It was a very symbolic thing. And there's a reason why I'm mentioning the Holy Roman Empire, because it's going to come up again in it's going to come up again in the history of the English kings. Because in fact, let me let the cat out of the bag now. The we've mentioned, people often talk about how English kings seem to be from German, of German origin, right? So we've seen that the English themselves had some Germanic ancestry, right? And but later on, we will see the House of Hanover, right? A German king. There was an elector. He was German from the House of Hanover in Germany. He was actually an elector, and he was an elector of Hanover. That was his title, and Hanover was a sovereign state in the Germanic in Germany, in the area of Germany, and one of these roles was to elect the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So they're very significant. And at some point, the English people, through the English people, decided uh, to have him and to have him become their king, and the heirs of the Protestant uh, Hanoverian. That's the electorate of Hanover. They're heirs to become English kings, British kings, and so we see George I was an elector of Hanover, and he became an English king as well. But I've jumped ahead, so you see, I'm just showing you how I'm the tying up connecting the dots. So she let you see how the Holy Roman Empire was significant, is relevant to the English crown. So, so we know from Charlemagne, we know how the English king, the European kings uh, came about the notion of the divine rights of kings. And so this is something that would cause civil wars later in England, right? The Europeans had this notion that the king was ordained by God and they had the divine rights to rule. So this was established in the sovereign laws of Europe and in England in particular, in England. So so in 1066, of course, William the Conqueror comes and he invades, um, he conquers England, and his military lords establish an aristocracy, right? And I guess now I should explain the aristocracy that was created in England. And of course, it still mildly exists today in England, but this was a form of government. So it was the king who was on top. The king was top of the pyramid, and of course, his royal relatives under him were lords, right? A lord, the highest lords were the Duke, right? We know dukes, for instance, from today, like a Duke of Sussex, Prince Harry. He's the son of a king. He's not going to be king himself, but he's a duke, right? And his uncles who are related to the king, they're also dukes, right? So the duke um, is the highest level of, of a lord, of a noble, right? So the Europeans and England, and it's very similar to what the ancien regime, what was called the ancien regime was. This is how society was organized and classified. Society was very hierarchical and structured during the Middle Ages. So the era we're in now was called the Middle Ages in history from 1066, and so this is how it was established. Um, so they had the king who was top of the chain, and then they had the nobility. The nobility, of course, are the aristocrats. Under the aristocrats, under the nobility are the peasants, right? Before the peasants, there's another class of people that started coming up. They were called the commoners. right? The commoners or the middling people, right? Because they owned some land, some property, some wealth, but they were not nobility, right? Because the noble class, they inherited their titles, right? They inherited large estates and their titles through primogeniture, the law of primogeniture, where it goes to the first son. The title, the lands, the estates, the wealth goes to the first son. And so there was let me start the way it goes. It goes in England specifically, it was the king, right? Under the king, there's the duke. Under the duke, so the duke owned large estates. A duke, for instance, a duke of Sussex, you could own an estate of about 1 million acres or more. 1 million acres, that's a lot, right? And part of the, what the a duke can do is they can raise armies. They have armies. That was how it was back then, not today anymore. Things are ceremonial now. Back then, they could raise armies, and they had judicial authority, administrative authority, legislative authority in the realm where they were dukes. So they were fiefdoms, right? And they derived their power from the kings. But these became hereditary, right? Hereditary titles. They also had the privilege of being represented in Parliament, in the House of Lords, permanently. They didn't have to be voted, so they're in the House of Lords. Later on, the House of Commons would come up. So the House of Commons is constituted back then was constituted of the commoners. Again, the commoners were actually gentlemen. They were gentlemen. They were a lower nobility. They were not titled nobility. So they included the knights, the gentry, esquires. So an esquire, for instance, is a lawyer, a barrister, right? So these are professional people. They had wealth. So instead of owning like 1 million acres in a state where they were lords and they had a government, if they established a form of government, of course, representing the king, they had a form of government. They didn't have that, but they just had private wealth. They could own uh, their lands. Maybe their land, they were wealthy. Their lands could be 100 acres, right? And but they didn't have any. They didn't have any hereditary titles. They were what's called armageros, right? Armageros, that is they could have their coat of arms. They could have a coat of arms. So I met a guy who was from his ancestors were from Scotland, and he was showing me his coat of arms in Maryland, and he thought because they had a coat of arms, it automatically meant they were aristocrats. No, they weren't aristocrats. So uh, the gentle people within the lower gentry, people who were they were not the nobility, but they were the gentility, right? They called them gentility. They were gentlemen, esquires. They could have their coat of arms. That was one of the benefits. So knights, for instance, so these were people of merit. They were normally men of merit, right? For instance, William Shakespeare, right? So if they're exceptional, they render a service to the king. They're exceptional in their profession and what they do. The king can give them a knighthood. So they were knights, right? So you have a title, like they call you sir, something, but it's your kids don't inherit it. It's not inheritable because you don't have vast estates like a duke, right? So under a duke is was a marquis. Under the marquis was an earl. Under an earl was a viscount, and under a viscount was a baron. So the baron was the lowest form of the aristocracy, right? So they were all within the aristocracy. They were titled. They had substantial estates, landowners, right? And under them were the commoners. The commoners, again, those are the gentry, the knights, the esquires, gentlemen, because these people had people of ability, right? Like Sir Isaac Newton, right? He was not an aristocrat, uh, an arist, and is a member of the aristocracy, but he was lower gentry. So Sir Isaac Newton, of course, was a genius. So was his mother, his parents. His father died, I think when he was young or something. But his mother had wealth, but she was not a member of the aristocracy because she didn't have uh, hered- hereditary titles. Remember, the aristocrats have hereditary titles. They're members, and they have the rights. They are members of the peerage, right? and they had a seat in the House of Lords. Um, but the lower gentry, they did not have these hereditary titles, so they were the ones who were known as people of merit, and these so they were a middling uh, group of people, and these were the people that Karl Marx, in his analysis of class struggle, these are the people he's referring to as the middle class, the bourgeois, the burgess. So the ones who were in the House of Burgesses, just like I mentioned in an earlier video that Thomas Jefferson was a member of the House of Burgesses in Virginia. So you see, Thomas Jefferson had a vast estate. He owned 600 slaves throughout his lifetime. He had substantial wealth in the Americas. He's one of the richest presidents we ever had, but he was not a member of the aristocracy, right? So he was a member of this new group of people who were neither the general population, they were neither the peasants or the working class, and neither were they the aristocrats. So they were the middling sort. They were called the middle class, the burgess, or the Bürger in German, or the bourgeois in French. So they were the middle class. They had wealth. They were highly educated. Now, so apart from them and below them, of course, were the peasants. The peasants, they were subjects and got to work the land on behalf of uh, the the uh, the lords of the estates, or the manor, who collected rents. They had the right to collect rents. Now, dukes, earls, they could tax. They had the right to collect taxes on behalf of the king. And you see, taxation would be a reason for substantial conflict between the parliament and the king. So the House of Lords, the commoners, those are the members of the gentry, right? They constituted parliament. They got representation in parliament, and they were the ones who were constantly in conflict with the king. So they're propertied people. They're people who had property, and they were trying to they kept getting into conflict with the king, because the king at the beginning of the millennium, right? They had um, they had absolute power, unlimited authority. And so you see, subsequently, his barons, his lords were trying to get power away from him, to share power with him. Um, so, and this started in 1215. You see, in around 1215 with the Magna Carta, King John was forced to sign and approve the Magna Carta, consent to the Magna Carta, and the Magna Carta in 1215. It's a it's a significant seminal document that English common law systems often refer to, and it inspired our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights as well. So it's in the Magna Carta that habeas corpus comes out, due process, and the rule of law. Even the king was subject to the rule of law, and he couldn't imprison his subjects without due process of law, without being, going through a judicial process. So you see that comes out in Magna Carta. That's 1215. So, and the notion of parliament as well. So the king was ruling alone. Initially, the king obviously has advisors, but the advisors served at the pleasure of the king initially, right? When he had unlimited power, he could choose to have people advise him, personal advisors, and he could fire them. But the barons, right? It was the barons who forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, right? To approve and accede to the Magna Carta. And this would come up later on, because they wanted the king to have a permanent council that he couldn't just fire, right? A permanent council that was constituted, not by the will of the king, that the king had to uh, accede to, had to respect and recognize. So this kept on going on, and so there were several civil wars. There was a civil war with it was um, it was started by a Frenchman who became an English noble. He was Earl of Leicester. His name was Simon de Montfort. Right. He was born in France, but he was a nobleman, and he got into opposition with King Henry III, and the idea was he was trying to institute parliament. He was trying to establish a form of parliament to make it a permanent fixture. Briefly, Earl of Leicester, that's Simon de Montfort, he briefly prevailed, and he was actually de facto ruler of England for about a year, and so he established what people, historians consider the earliest form of parliament, right? By calling the Oxford Parliament, because back then, it was just the nobles that were called as councils to the king. But this time, first of all, he called the Parliament of Oxford in order to limit the power of the king, right? So the king curtail the unlimited power of the king. And then a second parliament was called. This time, it brought a broad section of citizens, not just the nobles. And so the idea of parliamentary government and assemblies, they like to trace their origins, to the modern form of democracy, parliamentary government, to this guy, Earl of Leicester, Simon de Montfort. But however, he was killed a year later because the king came back, had more forces, and his armies prevailed. But prior to that, they've said the British, there was an Anglo-Saxon council, right, prior to the invasion of William the Conqueror and the Normans, right, prior to the Norman invasion, where they had what was called the Anglo-Saxon Council of the Wighton, of the Whitenagimot, right, Whitened. They were a form of council that made decisions and were an advisory council to the king. Um, and of course, William the Conqueror had his council. But again, these William the Conqueror's council, the idea, over time, they ruled at the pleasure of the king. They advised at the pleasure of the king, and they were picked personally by the king. Now, so things moved ahead, right? Religion became a very hot topic, hot button issue with the English, with the British. So by the more popular civil war. So we see there have been several civil wars in English history. But the more popular civil war that we normally know is the Puritan Civil War, right? That was instigated and started in 1642 under Charles I, when the Puritans eventually, they prevailed, and in 1649, under Oliver Cromwell, they had Charles I beheaded, and then the rule of Charles I, England was briefly under a Commonwealth, under a republic, right? Under Oliver Cromwell, who didn't take the title of king, called himself Lord Protector. So Oliver Cromwell himself was a Puritan. Now, what caused the Civil War in 1642? So Charles I was king, and we see this is where we see the issue of Protestantism and Catholicism, the conflicts that came about, right? So um, prior to that, we know Henry VIII had sort of removed England from under the authority of the Roman Catholic Church because of his issue of marriage. He wanted to marry, right? He was trying to get a male heir, and so he became the head of the Church of England. And you see that was the era of the Reformation all over, starting with the German monk Martin Luther, and the church split up, and there were the Protestants, and all sorts of splinter groups came up, factions in Christianity. And these caused huge religious wars all over Europe. And of course, England was not immune. So England had its own share of wars, religious wars. And so they at some point they'd have a Catholic king, at some point they'd want to have a Protestant king. But importantly, the Protestants were very powerful, so they didn't want Catholic kings anymore. So Charles I was a Stuart, right? He was a member of the Stuart house, right? The House of Stuart. The House of Stuart, that was from James I, and James I was son of Mary, Queen of the Scots, who was, of course, beheaded by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth the First. But Queen Elizabeth the First had no heirs, and so uh, James the First succeeded her, and he was, so he established the House of Stuart. Now, Charles the First married. He was Anglican, but he started to show sympathies towards the Catholics, and the British, were really anti-Catholic around this period, and so they're very suspicious of his actions. Especially, he'd married a Catholic princess, and so religion was one of the issues that caused that civil war, and also taxes. And he was, he had this arrogant way towards parliament. For 11 years, he ruled without parliament, and he was raising taxes, and he was raising taxes, collecting taxes. He didn't confer with parliament, and of course, parliament did not like this, so they sought to curtail his powers, right? And so it gave him 19 propositions, 19 propositions to basically, they were trying to become co-sovereign with the king, right? They were trying to reduce his powers. For instance, they were asking that, okay, he needed to get consent in order to levy taxes. He needed to get consent, include that parliamentary consent and approval was required for royal marriages. Of course, that was to make sure that kings and princes, the royal household, did not marry Catholics. He had married a Catholic, and so he refused this because he thought that it was infringing on the divine right of a king, because the monarchs, the kings, were absolute monarchists, right? They are absolute monarchs at the time. They had unlimited power, even though they had been moved to try and limit their powers. And so he refused, and he famously stated that nolimus leges, nolimus leges Anglia, mutari, right? So that means we are not, going to change the laws of England. So that was a Latin phrase that he said to have spoken in his refusal to the 19 propositions from Parliament. That's nolimus legis Anglia uh, mutari. So that's, we are not going to change the laws of England. And of course, he tried to arrest five of the members of parliament, which was sort of a breach of their privilege. And this instigated the war. Now, somebody who was a member of parliament was Oliver Cromwell. The Puritans were very powerful in parliament at the time. Now, we know Puritans in America, like Puritans, they're part of our history. They became very popular. So you can see this was in the 17th century. Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan. They were very powerful in England. They were anti-Catholic as well, and so Oliver Cromwell was not a member of the aristocracy, but he was a gentleman farmer. He was a member of Parliament. To be a member of Parliament, you had to at least have property. So he was a member of that gentry class, the gentility, the lower gentry, and so he was a gentleman farmer. His father, they had land, they had estates. So he was a Puritan, and he was in the military. He rose rapidly. So uh, uh, King Charles the First declared war, and the parliamentarians, so the royalists and the parliamentarians, they fought. Oliver Cromwell rose rapidly, and they had a series of successes, and they eventually defeated the king and the royalists, and they had the king beheaded. And Oliver Cromwell, he established the Commonwealth, which was a republic, and they ruled um, under very moralistic codes, and his rule was very draconian. The British even hated his rule more than they hated the rule of the kings, and so, but of course, everybody feared him. It was a very moralistic period, and he said he was establishing a godly nation. That was what he was trying to do, and so it was a very draconian era, and everybody feared him. But he died. When he died, his son took over, but they were able to depose his king, and they asked the son of Charles I to come back. So they reestablished the parliamentarians, the lords, because the British aristocracy was very entrenched, right? They're very entrenched. They're not like the Russian aristocracy, right, where everything sort of depended on the absolutist rule of the Russian emperor. That's emperor. So that's why the you see during the Bolshevik Revolution of the 20th century, it was so easy to um, to get rid of the aristocrats and establish the rule of the working class, the proletariats. But not so in England, because the aristocrats, they were aristocracy was very entrenched in England. They were very powerful. Yes, they could sit kings, and this was what they were trying to do, and they did it um, successfully. When Oliver Cromwell died, they brought back a king, and of course, he was a member of the Stuart again. And so they liked Charles II. Charles II, he was a very libertine, uh, free period. And however, his son, they didn't like so much. James II, they didn't like his son so much because, again, he was sort of he was a Catholic. James II was a Catholic, and they didn't like him so much, so he was king for only about 3 years. And the parliamentarians, ever full of intrigue and conniving and always trying to get power away from the king, they went to arrange with the daughter of James II, the daughter of the king. Her name was Mary, and she was married to a guy called William of Orange. He was Prince of the Netherlands, right? William of Orange. William of Orange was actually also the grandson of James, so he was cousins to, he was a nephew of the king, uh, but he was a prince, he was a Dutch, a prince of the Netherlands, so they persuaded him to accept the throne of England with his wife. So it was the only time we had, England had a joint monarchy. So they ruled jointly. That's Mary and her husband, who was her cousin, William of Orange. They ruled England as king and queen. So they came and they deposed James II. That's Mary's father. He fled to France, and he got protection from the King of France, who was Louis XIV. So this was in 1688. It's called the Glorious Revolution. Now, prior to that, though, the prior to the accession to the throne, the Parliament made William and Mary swear an oath to what they call the Declaration of Rights, and also called the Bill of Rights of 1689, and it basically made England a constitutional monarchy. So they weakened the power of the king. So it was really ceremonial, and it made Parliament more powerful than the king. And so you see elements of the Bill of Rights that we know in our Bill of Rights. It came in elements like, um, let me say one, no, that there are no cruel and unusual punishments. You can't be held. There can't be excessive bills and fines. That was actually in the Bill of Rights that the William and Mary had to take an oath to before they occupied the throne of England. So the it had a lot of features of elements of the Bill of Rights that we know, and they made sure that the king had to accede to he had to get consent uh, to declare war, and it now instituted the legitimacy and authority of Parliament to legislate and to impose taxes, right? So they also made the King of England uh, to depend on his money, uh, uh, to depend on Parliament for his expenditures and his money. So it was Parliament who had to authorize the pay of the king. So they provided a grant of about £700,000 a year to the king. But they almost virtually neutered the king and made the king of England a constitutional monarchy and remove the unlimited powers and the absolute monarchy that used to be the case. And so you see the progenitor of what the framers were doing with the king, right? They as well, because the this had been done already in England. They had limited the powers of the king had been curtailed by Parliament. Parliament, of course, was full of the noble people, the noblemen, right, and the propertied people. So they were basically sharing power with the king. In fact, they now had more power than the king in government, and they established the permanency of the government of the Parliament. Um, there are many other things. They also made they made they explicitly put in this Bill of Rights that they excluded Roman Catholics, any Catholic, from becoming a king or sovereign of England, or becoming king or queen of England, and they could not marry. No king or queen could marry a Catholic. So they established um, the religious and dynastic succession. Later on, there was what was called the Act of Settlement of 1701 because William and Mary were both sickly. In fact, Mary would die shortly after. She died, I think it was in 1694. She was about 32. She died childless. So did William. William died shortly after in 1702. He was very sickly and they knew he was going to die. And so they had an Act of Settlement in which they now established that um, the descendants, right, Sophia of Hanover, who was a granddaughter of James I, the King of England, she and her heirs would have they would have claims to they were the heirs to the throne of England because they were Protestants, right? They were German Protestants, and that was from the electorate of Hanover. So that's how the German princes and princesses came over and became kings and queens of England. So uh, after uh, after Mary died, uh, you know, William himself died shortly after. Now, they had been engaged in a war with France, right? That's a 9 year war with France. And of course, under his reign, they established the Bank of England in about 1694. So you see, these things, these events, these developments started to change the power of England significantly and make them more ascendant in as an imperial power. And of course, they were constantly in rivalry with France, the arch nemesis. So after he died, Mary's younger sister Anne acceded to the throne, but she also died. She had a son, but the son died at 11. She died 1714. So that's how the throne now went to George the First, who was an elector from the House of uh, from Hanover. He was elector of Hanover. Now, the elector of Hanover, I'd mentioned, that was in Germany, and it was a sovereign state in Germany. It was a very prestigious sovereign state in Germany because they got to elect the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So George the First was an elector, and then he was German, but he was he was a great grandson he was a descendant of uh, of King James the First of England. So he became uh, King of England, Scotland, and of course Ireland, but he also remained as ruler of Hanover. Now, by the time he became king, so it was George the First. Um, by the time he became king, Parliament was now more powerful than the king, and since he was also ruler of Hanover. He preferred to be there most of the time, and Parliament approved for him to be there. And Parliament was mainly ruling the government, and this was when we had our first de facto prime minister, Robert Walpole, and he was very powerful. And the parliament, the cabinet as we know it, started to evolve under him, and they became very powerful. You see how the British Parliament today, the cabinet, they're very powerful today. So this was from the era of Robert Walpole, who was the first de facto prime minister of England. And George I was usually mainly in Hanover, mainly in Germany, running affairs there because he remained the ruler of Hanover while he was also King of England, of course, uh, King of Britain. That's including Scotland and Ireland. So, and of course, after him was his son. There was his heir. There was George II, and it goes on and on. So the kings of England, they united that the rulership of the House of the electorate of Hanover and the throne of Britain. It was in the person of the English British monarch, although they ruled them as separate countries until 1837, right, until the era of Queen Victoria. So the Queen in 1837, Queen Victoria was because she was female, there was what was called the Asalic law of the Franks, right? Remember, I talked about the Franks. That's from Charlemagne. They had a law that the throne, the rulership, the sovereignty could only pass to a male heir, not to a female. So when Queen Victoria became Queen of England, she had to, the elector of Hanover title went to her uncle, and she just was Queen of Britain, right? So, and she took the name of the house of the sovereign of England changed to Saxe Coburg Gotha. That was the name of her husband, Prince Albert. The family name of her husband, Saxe Coburg Gotha, and so that's the German name that they took. And they changed this in 1917. The King George V changed it during the First World War to Windsor, right? They changed uh, Saxe Coburg Gotha to Windsor in 1917, when during the First World War, when England was at war with Germany, to make it sound, not to make the British populace have angst about their monarchs, maybe selling England out to the Germans, to their German relatives who they were at war with. So it was changed to Windsor, and that's what we have today, Windsor, the House of Windsor. So that's the British, that's the English of, sorry, that's the history of the English monarchs, and you see how it affects us in America. I want to stop the video here, and I'll continue with my analysis of the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence and the comparisons with the English legacy. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and I also draw attention to color of law violations, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the court, which I've been experiencing under a corrupt, racist, and xenophobic judge in Montgomery County, Maryland, Judge James Bonifant. I was swatted and I was framed by Montgomery County, Maryland, police officers from my home on May 16, 2023, in order to obstruct justice. They had a man impersonated as my uncle and who fabricated an emergency evaluation petition, and the swatting, they falsified police reports of a crisis. I was never going through a crisis. I was never threatening anybody. I've never threatened anybody. I was never going through any sort of mental health crisis. I'm a salubrious, healthy male, physically and mentally, and I've been doing these videos. I'm astonished at the violations of the rule of law and the corruption in Maryland's criminal justice system. And I'm hoping that I get justice. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.